Hello, Psych of Adjustment. Let us talk some communication as we kind of move through. We're probably, officially maybe at the last quarter of our course, give or take. Certainly within the last third. So communication is, I believe, the last lecture within this module. So let us then talk about communication. Believe it or not, I was an organizational communication major in my first run through at school while I was at the paper mill. I became a psychology major after I quit my job and changed schools. My school didn't offer communications, organizational communications, so I went to psychology. But I love psychology, and that was always my first choice anyway. So once I was free of Boise Cascade and them helping with my tuition, I felt free to change my major at a cost of only about 2 years worth of schooling. Those of you who've changed majors know what it can mean, especially if you're pretty well along in your current major and change to a radically different major. Not that psychology and communication are radically different, but very few courses overlap actually between those two majors. So Annika and Penelope are going to join us here. We'll see how that goes. They're pretty good friends, being sisters, but this spot up here is a cherished spot, so we'll see what happens. They're looking at each other like they're not going to share it. So that's their communication, if you will. I can detect it in the posture and the eye contact, etc. Let's talk the platinum rule. And the golden rule has been around a good long time. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But let's talk the platinum rule. Treat others the way they would like to be treated. Or do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And notice that this opens the door to communication, because if I'm going to treat someone the way they want to be treated, then I have to pretty much ask them, how do you want to be treated? Or I have to be super sensitive to that. And then I make choices based on that. This idea that everyone wants to be treated like I want to be treated is, could be problematic. So thus the platinum rule, platinum being more valuable than gold, the newer iteration of selflessness, if you will. And this gets down to the idea of political correctness, and I have a hard time with political correctness or the resistance to being kind. Now, we had a kindness experience, so you kind of probably are pretty much up where I am. Why the hell can't we be kind? And if someone says, look, I don't like you using that term, I find that offensive, then it appears to me the kind thing to do would say, wow, I didn't understand that. You'd like me to treat you differently? You'd like me to use a different term to describe you? Well, you know what? In terms of kindness, then I would like to do that, right? So this issue, and I've worked in a lot of places where political, we got to take harassment training. Oh, we got to take diversity training. Oh, we got to take this. We got to take this, Those who complain about political correctness, and I've heard a lot of people complain about it, some might offer that the whole phenomenon of the 2016 was, at least in part, the 2016 election was in part driven by this feeling that being politically correct is somehow being forced upon us, and I'm saying no. I don't know. I don't want to label it political correctness. I want to call it basic human kindness. If someone doesn't want to be referred to in a certain way, then why would I continue to insist on referring to them that way? I mean, it just kind of seems like an unkind behavior. So those that complain about political correctness, I'm entitled to say on, so let's go through the conversation, because I've heard it, a lot at the lumber mill, the paper mill, etc. Entitled to say what's on their mind because, and then fill in the blank, whatever reason's being supplied. They've been previously embarrassed from perceived lack of political savvy, so they, rather than take responsibility, they now start blaming it on political correctness, right? They feel their power, their freedom is being diminished or constrained in some way. And it's like, so my power to call you what I want to call you, even though you're offended about it, is now being threatened? I don't know what kind of power that is, and we had a discussion of power, so maybe you can, pigeonhole that type of power. Right? Perceive the feelings of others as unimportant. I don't care what those people, if they don't want to be referred to that, it doesn't matter to me. Right? Or find new rules governing communication as petty. Oh, this is just petty, right? This is just, what difference does a word make? And as a psychologist who dabbles in psycholinguistics, let me tell you that words matter. Okay, it's less about PC and more about other issues, and those issues remain undefined, undescribed, and we start whispering about it in this kind of conspiratorial tone, etc. Let's get to the idea of jokes and humor, and this is where a lot of political incorrectness would surface, if we want to call it that. And Freud loved jokes, right? Freudian perspective suggests that jokes are a way of reducing anxiety as a result of suppressing urges to say something questionable. So I want to say this, but you know, the id wants to say this. The id is the drive to say it, say it, say it. But the superego is saying, you know what? Other people might consider that offensive. Other people might be insulted. Actually, it's not all that kind to say something like that, but the id is saying, say it, say it, say it. And the superego is saying, no, I don't think you should say it. And people become anxious whenever the id and the superego are in conflict. So, and I think this is a lot of the what's so behind the resistance to being politically correct, right? That people find themselves becoming anxious, and then they employ a bunch of defense mechanisms to kind of buffer themselves from that anxiety. So you guys should be pretty up on this conversation, since we've had assignments that kind of directly talked about the conflict, the anxiety, and the defense mechanisms. And think about it. Jokes are often used to denigrate or demean, but that boosts self-esteem. So when I talk smack about another group, social identity theory says, look, if I talk smack about another group, I somehow make them look less than, then it boosts my self-esteem. So these derogatory jokes can be a source of a boost of self-esteem. So people often, especially with fragile or relatively low self-esteem, right, and especially low implicit self-esteem, kind of get off on the jokes because they feel like big man on campus in telling those jokes, so to speak. Jokes often reveal prejudicial ideology, and that is long-standing prejudices are often manifested in jokes. Think about the joke. You've got a rabbi, a priest, and a Buddhist monk walk into a bar. Now, is this joke going to be based on anything beyond or besides stereotypes? And no, I don't have a joke in mind. That was just an example. So if you're waiting for punchline, it ain't coming on that one. Jokes are often used in conjunction with social identity mechanisms that differentiate in-group from out-group. So let's try this joke here, because it is possible, I think, to tell jokes without necessarily offending others. What's the best thing about Switzerland? I don't know, but the flag is a big plus. That's pretty simple. But notice, I didn't invoke any stereotypes about the Swiss or anybody else, right? I might have offended minus signs through this. I don't know, but otherwise, I think we're pretty safe. So, humor and jokes upsides. Well, humor and jokes foster intimacy, especially when we have shared meaning and we get it, right? You get it, and especially inside jokes, right? That term, inside jokes. Makes others feel good. It's good to laugh, right? It buffers stress. Dark humor. Often we make jokes about unpleasant potential outcomes as a way of buffering the anxiety of those outcomes actually being possible. Positive psychology suggests that joking is a component, right, of a wide variety of behaviors described as transcendent, that is, transcending the moment, right, and getting to a higher plane. So, appreciation of humor correlates with wisdom and a love of learning. So, it's not to say jokes are bad, but jokes that are about or jokes that make their point at the expense of others obviously erase a lot of these gains, I believe. So getting it? What are the 3 steps to joking? Well, we mentally represent the setup of the joke. So someone's telling the joke and we're going on, so we mentally represent. That is, we take in the information that's the lead in and we mentally represent it. We detect an incongruity in its multiple interpretations, and that's usually the way the jokes run. It could be interpreted this way or that way, and that's part of what makes it funny. We resolve the incongruity by inhibiting the literal, non-funny interpretation, and then that increases our appreciation of the funny interpretation. So current research is embracing humor as potentially different from different from other types of reasoning. And I think the neuroscientists will probably help us out with this. Okay, so a little on jokes there, and there's a little website there if you want to go check out more on this. Now, loaded language, or speaking in code. Speaking in code, right? Loaded language, aka high interference, right, is intended to evoke emotional imagery and responses. So I was talking to a teacher the other day, and she actually works for the financial advisor that my wife and I use, and he's talking about what a great find is, and I met with her, and I asked her, so, because I like to engage people in conversation, so why did you leave teaching? Because she's, certainly not at an age where she had to retire. She said, well, things are just different. It seems that the people in the school now are a lot different, right? And the parents don't really, and I'm going, so this woman is using loaded language, which is different, means different in terms of race, different in terms of color, different in terms of background, and she becomes uncomfortable with it, right? So loaded language is this kind of code. It often relies on stereotypes to support the prejudice, typically operates outside of critical thinking. Loaded language often goes unnoticed in its effects, that is, it just goes over, we don't notice, but it's having a non-conscious effect. And it makes it very difficult when we're processing material non-consciously without any kind of conscious oversight. Remember peripheral cues, peripheral processing? All right, that's very simplistic. So processing it largely non-consciously, it becomes next to impossible to instigate corrections on non-consciously processed material. So let's watch this little video about loaded language. I think it's going to do a better job than I did. So here we go. I'm going to put this down here so we pick up the sound. Hopefully the sound is on the computer, and we're good to go. And we're good to go. Or not. There we go.
In rhetoric, loaded language, also known as loaded terms or emotive language, is wording that attempts to influence an audience by using appeal to emotion or stereotypes. Such wording is also known as high-inference language or language persuasive techniques. Loaded words and phrases have strong emotional implications and involve strongly positive or negative reactions beyond their literal meaning. For example, the phrase tax relief refers literally to changes that reduce the amount of tax citizens must pay. However, use of the emotive word relief implies that all tax is an unreasonable burden to begin with. Examples of loaded language are: you want to go to the mall, don't you? And do you really want to associate with those people? Loaded terms, also called emotive or ethical words, were clearly described by Charles Stevenson. He noticed that there are words that do not merely describe a possible state of affairs. Terrorist is not used only to refer to a person who commits specific actions with a specific intent. Words such as torture or freedom carry with them something more than a simple description of a concept or an action. They have a magnetic effect, an imperative force, a tendency to influence the interlocutor's decisions. They are strictly bound to moral values, leading to value judgments, and potentially triggering specific emotions. For this reason, they have an emotive dimension. In the modern psychological terminology, we can say that these terms carry emotional valence, as they presuppose and trigger a value judgment that can lead to an emotion. The appeal to emotion is often seen as being in contrast to an appeal to logic and reason. However, emotion and reason are not necessarily always in conflict, nor is it true that an emotion cannot be a reason for an action. Authors R. Malcolm Murray and Nabosa Kujundra distinguish prima facie reasons from considered reasons when discussing this. A prima facie reason for, say, not eating mushrooms is that one does not like mushrooms. This is an emotive reason. However, one still may have a considered reason for not eating mushrooms. One might consume enough of the relevant minerals and vitamins that one could obtain from eating mushrooms from other sources. An emotion, elicited via emotive language, may form a prima facie reason for action, but further work is required before one can obtain a considered reason. Emotive arguments and loaded language are particularly persuasive, because they exploit the human weakness for acting immediately based upon an emotional response, without such further considered judgment. Due to such potential for emotional complication, it is generally advised to avoid loaded language in argument or speech when fairness and impartiality is one of the goals. Anthony Weston, for example, admonishes students and writers, in general, avoid language whose only function is to sway the emotions. Politicians cultivate loaded language, and often study how to use it effectively, which words to use or avoid using to gain political advantage or disparage an opponent. Heller gives the example that it is common for a politician to advocate investment in public services, because it has a more favorable connotation than public spending. One aspect of loaded language is that loaded words and phrases occur in pairs, sometimes as political framing techniques by individuals with opposing agendas. Heller calls these a boo version and a hooray version, to differentiate those with negative and positive emotional connotations. Examples include bureaucrat versus public servant, anti-choice versus pro-life, regime versus government, and elitist versus expert. In the 1946 essay Politics and the English Language, George Orwell discussed the use of loaded language in political discourse. The word fascism has now no meaning except insofar as it signifies something not desirable. The words democracy, socialism, freedom, patriotic, realistic, justice have each of them several different meanings which cannot be reconciled with one another. In the case of a word like democracy, not only is there no agreed definition, but the attempt to make one is resisted from all sides. It is almost universally felt that when we call a country democratic we are praising it. Consequently, the defenders of every kind of regime claim that it is a democracy, and fear that they might have to stop using that word if it were tied down to any one meaning.
Okay then, guys, a little bit on loaded language. Let me get our presentation back up here, and there we go. So, notice that loaded language is designed to not elucidate, but it's designed to manipulate. Okay? And we can see that loaded language then might be one of the primary opponents of critical thinking, because it takes us away from a rational analysis of arguments to an emotional analysis of arguments, and we're no longer critically thinking at that point. So for our assignment, and this is a multi-part assignment, right? So for homework 13, part A, loaded language. 2 examples of loaded language are needed, so you're going to have to go out there and search and notice. It's probably not going to be very hard to find them. Please present your examples on the assignment template and give a brief explanation of how they represent loaded language. Okay, and also this video clip will be available, right? It's just an audio clip. It'll be available alongside this lecture in Carmen, so you'll probably maybe want to listen to it again. So let's continue on. Let's talk about I versus we. And again, studies have found that it's tied to self versus other orientation, and those who have a self orientation are probably going to use I more often than we. Low status individuals tend to use I more frequently, right? In an effort to boost their status, to take credit for things is one component of that. High status individuals tend to use we more frequently. But now there can be a downside too, because the royal we is we means I, but we, because I'm the head of the country, I'm royalty, then what I think applies to everyone, so it becomes we. Kind of a different issue, but you can see how it can get foggy. Want to sound like a leader? We is the better way to go in positive situations, right? want to engender loyalty and admiration, I becomes a better choice in situations with negative outcomes. So if you want to protect your people and you're the leader, then I'm sorry, that is my fault, that's my responsibility that this occurred, right? At least in a public forum. And then your employees, your peeps, they say, wow, they got my back, he didn't throw me under the bus, right? And when something good happens, rather than being a blowhard and taking all the credit, I say, we engineered the solution. And so leaders know how to use this effectively, and you can often pinpoint the difference between a leader and a manager, right? A leader is someone who will follow this program. A manager might often go the other way. So, facilitation style of communication. Consider Tom Peters' four most important words for a leader is, in fact, hi Annika, what do you think? And notice, this opens the door to communication. People love to share what they think, don't you, Annika? And so it's one of the greatest questions you can ask your people is, what do you think? It opens the door to conversation, right? And it shows that you value people because you're willing to ask them what they think, right? So it solicits participation. It seeks clarification, which is always important. You listen intently upon asking that question. Don't just throw the question out and then go to texting or whatever. And often uses summary statements to verify discussed material. So typical leader facilitation, what do you think? Now, if you take Org Psych with me, you know I'm going to ask you, that's Tom Peters' four most important words. My four most important words that follow on Peters is, how do you know? But that's a different story for a different time. Right? So effective facilitation, you can work through this in your example, right? Here's some core skilling, your core skills, framing, learn everyone's name, right? This is just a nice little graphic that shows how to improve our communication styles, especially within a leadership context. Okay? So benefits to facilitative communication. Increases the knowledge of all parties, because if I'm asking everyone, what do you think, that means we're all becoming aware of what we all think or sharing information, right? It increases participant self-valuing, as I described, because people say, wow, he really cares what I think because he just asked what I think and actually listened and was actually able to paraphrase. So let me get this straight. You are saying that you think that, and then I repeat it back in my own words, right? It can enhance ideational diversity. If we go around the room and ask everyone what they think, right, we can get a bunch of diverse responses, hopefully. And it can lead to more effective problem solving by generating a lot more ideas around the issue. So, huge benefits to this kind of facilitative communication. Now, let's talk about the notion of winning versus learning, since we were talking about learning other people's ideas, versus winning. Right? Consider one's goal in an exchange. If I'm going to engage in a conversational exchange with someone, is my goal to beat the other? And that is to kind of manipulate the conversation so that eventually I box them into a corner and then I can smack them down at that point in time. Or is it to enhance my own appearance? Am I doing this in a public display and I want to make someone look foolish, right? Or, let's say it's not about winning, it's about learning, then is it better to better understand, or is it to improve my relationship with my co-conversant? So, management is about arranging and telling. Leadership is about nurturing and enhancing, and that's a profound difference. And again, I'm going to Tom Peters because I think Tom Peters has probably done more leadership studies than anybody on the planet. And if you're interested in that, I'd love to see you in organizational communication every fall, as it's been in the past. So I hope it sticks to that. End of part 2. I'll see you. End of part 1. I'll see you for part